You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast, and I have Kelly Dorfman. She's an author and a nutritionist, and her focus appears to be using nutrition therapeutically to improve brain function, energy, and mood, which are all super important things. So, Kelly, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Richard. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So how did you get into this? How did you get into nutrition first, and then why this area specifically?
Excellent questions. Well, I was a psychology major, and I was told when I was a senior I had to get ready for my PhD, and I was putting myself through school and didn't have enough money for that. So I was looking for something I could do that would be more practical, and I went home. I was food shopping for my mother. My mother hated to food shop, and I ran into a book called Sugar Blues, which is an old book from the 80s about how sugar affects your health. And I thought, wow, here's something that's really, really practical that I could do. So I changed my major and into nutrition, but I always wanted to use it therapeutically. I was disappointed that it was such an ancillary technique and strategy very often. I wanted to use it as a primary strategy, and that's always been my interest. And because I've always taken on difficult cases, I ended up getting a lot of brain cases, a lot of kids with development problems, a lot of older people with memory problems. So I developed a lot of interest in mood and behavior and brain issues. That's the short.
Because the easy cases are easy. The hard ones are the most interesting.
Yeah, and it just keeps you digging. And I have a family that's full of brain issues. My father had a brain tumor. My mother had brain cancer. My stepfather had a brain aneurysm. So one of my aunts said, boy, there must be something in the water. But whatever it was, it did get me interested in brain stuff. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. It's, the people that work in health are like superheroes because they all have their own origin story where they were down in the dumps and something happened and then they decided to overcome it and become a hero to their friends and family. So you fit right in.
Well, yeah, except that I was lucky. It wasn't a personal thing so much that I was trying to fix my own terrible health. But I was not lucky. I didn't have terrible health, although when I did change my diet, I felt better. But no, it was just, yes, the people around me. So, yep, I guess we all, what did they call that? The wounded healer or something. So perhaps that's what it is.
So I'm glad to talk to you because, I speak to a lot of nutritionists and health people, and they'll give advice on how to help this, that, or the other. And then I ask them about the hard cases, and they don't shy away from them, but they kind of say, well, you can't help everybody. I've heard some people say that. So tell me about some of the difficult cases and what lengths did you have to go to help people?
Well, I have many, many difficult cases, and sometimes the difficult cases are very straightforward if you look through the history long enough and you can find a thread. Like I had somebody sent to me recently that had hives all over her body, and that's a tough one because the allergist couldn't figure out what the problem was, and she'd been tested a bunch of times, and she was completely miserable. She was missing work. She was itching all the time, and I looked through all of her voluminous amounts of records because that's what you do when you're a detective and when you have a difficult case. And she had Hashimoto's disease. And one of the weird secondary issues with Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid autoimmune disease, is chronic hives. So I said to her, I said, what are you doing about this Hashimoto's? And she said, what Hashimoto's? And yeah, she'd never had, doctor didn't notice it, never been treated for it. And so in that case, I just kicked her right back to her doctor. So that was very, very simple, very straightforward. And other times, if it's something like eosinophilic esophagitis, where there's a lot of white cells in the throat or is some kind of cognitive issue, you're looking at long-term management strategies. And they tend to work very well, but you have to have a fair amount of patience for things going wrong and for tweaking. So I do, I guess.
Where do you
What?
So what helps you in your detective work? What do people? Can people do anything to help you, to help them, or what kind of records do they assemble?
Yeah, mostly they do all the work, to be honest with you, and I just sit there and listen. Most of the time, I would say people tell me what the answer is, and they just don't know they know the answer, or they have no confidence in what the answer is. But I would say, gosh, maybe 3/4 of the time, people pretty much have an idea and are not shocked. Now, this woman with the Hashimoto's was very shocked and upset, but that was a medical problem that had been missed. That's unusual, but other times people would say, "Oh yeah, I mean, I thought about that, but I mentioned it to the ABC person, and they said no, that couldn't be." So sometimes it's just building confidence and building a case around it, and also treating the person, not the test. I mean, a lot of times people come in with tests, and the tests look okay, but clinically they're not functioning well, and in that case, you always deal with the person, not the test results. So that helps.
I've heard a lot about this. Someone's in range for jumping. The doctor says you're in range, but the person still feels bad.
Right. Like I just saw a little kid and he's not growing properly, and he is technically in range for his thyroid, but he's passing with a D minus. I mean, he's barely. I mean, it's not robust. So the question is, when you have a non-robust test result and you have a child who has a serious symptom and he really has not grown much at all in the last 2 years, do you treat anyway? And that's in medicine, it's always safer in terms of not being sued, not to treat. So you run on this razor edge. The doctor said, yeah, he goes, I'm on the fence about it because of this growth problem. We probably should treat, but he's very reluctant to treat because he's not technically out of range.
So what are the biggest modulators of health and disease that you see in general?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that nutrition therapy breaks down basically into two worlds. The first world is, are you eating something that's bothering you? So you're always screening to see if the person's symptoms are possibly symptoms of something that they're eating that's irritating them. And usually those are irritating like symptoms, like their stomach hurts, they get sick a lot, they're always picking up this cold or that cold, they have some kind of rash. So there's some kind of irritation problem. And then sometimes the irritation is much more subtle. And then the other thing is, are you missing something that could help you? And that's the therapeutic nutrition intervention. And so you're bouncing back in between these two worlds. And most of the answers are in one of those two places. Now, a lot of people concentrate only on removing irritants, like taking out allergens and food reactives of foods. But that's not good enough. That's like taking the tacks or the nails out of your driveway and expecting your tires to get better. I mean, tires aren't a live system, but it's one thing to remove irritants, and that's important. But at the same time, you have to make sure you're doing enough healing strategies to help to repair. And so we're looking at both of those kind of things. And, most conditions, Richard, these days are walking wounded conditions. I mean, there are some very dangerous diseases out there that can knock people down, and cancer and those type of things. But a lot of things that we're looking at are chronic autoimmune diseases, for example, have gone way up, so that they're long-term management type things. Allergies, just feeling generally fatigued or fuzzy-headed. These are conditions that don't always have a disease that you can just throw a drug at, right? Not a pill for every ill. I mean, what they are is they're long-term complicated situations that need to be managed. And nutrition works very well in those situations. Whereas if you get run over by a truck, you want to go to your doctor because they're very, very good at that.
What about, I'll give you an example. So my wife was taking metformin
and I read on my own that it can deplete B12. So I told this to her, and she supplemented with B12 and other Bs, and she feels better. Is there an area whereby you look at the medication someone takes and you see not just side effects, but possible depletions and other levels that would indicate that they need to take something to supplement the medication? And do you do that?
Oh, absolutely. That's, as a matter of fact, in complicated cases, one of the first things you do is you go through the medication and see if the symptoms they're complaining about are simply side effects of the medication. And half the time, that is the case, that the problem is not more complicated than they're taking six medicines. And, a few of them have the side effects they're complaining about, where they've added all the medicines up and they add up to side effects that aren't clearly known, because usually when you look up side effects, it's per medicine, not per group of medicines. And many people are on groups of medicines now. So the metformin one is a good one. Of course, the statin drugs, which many people take, they deplete a lot of things. One of the biggest selling drugs in the country are PPIs, protein pump inhibitors, used for reflux, and they are devastating nutritionally. I spent a lot of time digging people out of trouble from long-term PPI use. That would be Prilosec and what is the other? Well, you would recognize omeprazole is another one, and that's the generic name for it. And that interferes with B12, zinc, iron, vitamin D, protein, calcium, magnesium, and they were designed to be used. Yeah, they were designed to be used for 8 weeks, and a lot of people use them for years. So yes, drug nutrient interactions are a huge thing. Another thing is that people don't realize that over 90% of drugs now are generic, and there's a generic drug crisis now because they're almost all made overseas and they're monitored very poorly, not for lack of trying on the FDA's part, but for lack of resources. They can't even visit all these factories, and a lot of them are in poor areas. There's contaminants that have been found in many of these. A lot of them have sort of fudged records to create drugs. There's an interesting book that just came out about this called Bottle of Lies, which is about the generic industry. And recently, over the last few years, I found several people whose symptoms really were because the generic drugs they were taking just didn't work, or they switched from one generic. Yeah, so from one generic to another generic because, if you go to Giant or Harris Teeter or Costco, wherever you buy your drugs, the first, January you get them, they might be from India. March they might be from China. And then, in April they might be from another factory in India. They're getting them wherever they're cheapest. And the generic drugs,
horrible.
Yeah, well, the generic drugs are supposed to be exactly the same, but they're not exactly the same. They've never been exactly the same. They're kind of close, but they're not monitored. Unfortunately, right now, they're not monitored well at all. So I've been recently switching a lot of people, having them go back to their doctors and talk to their doctors about brand name medicines. And some of the top clinics in the country that work with very sensitive people, like organ transplant people, are only using non-generic medicines now. So,
yeah, I was going to ask you, what do you do about that? You just have to go to brand names, and are there brand names for every drug you need, or are there some that you're stuck with generic?
Some of them don't. Like Prozac, for example, is not made anymore, only as its generic form, fluconazole. But what you can do is you can go to a CIPA, a Canadian International Pharmacy Association, which is CIPA.com, and you can get very often name brands for not much more than you're paying for insurance for generic drugs. Not always. Some of the newer drugs are still pretty expensive, but I found, now this is not normal, but I haven't found medicines that are 95% cheaper. They're brand name medicines. I had a patient call me in a panic. She was recommended to take a medicine that used to be about $50. It's an old medicine. And, there's been a crisis because the costs are going way up. So their insurance was going to charge her $1,000. And I found it for $50 in Canada at a certified pharmacy. So you can, they also tell you when you do it that way, what country it's coming from. And that's, you can have some choices. But I do think this generic drug problem is actually a crisis that they had a big recall. I don't know if you saw this, of a blood pressure medicine last year, and it had carcinogens in it. Yes. So, and a bunch of, and they said, don't worry about it. Probably wasn't much, and it was only in animal studies. But these companies, they're under a lot of pressure to make money, and they have been consistently cutting corners. So I think that you have to really be much more involved in your care. People say, oh, vitamins aren't regulated. They are regulated. There's all kinds of rules, but there's nobody out there really checking. And the food situation is no different. We really are in a buyer beware economy now. You buy something and it's really up to you to figure out if it's going to be worthwhile.
Could you, I mean, there's a problem. How could you figure out if a medicine has stuff in it that would hurt you unless you go to a lab? Same thing with food, how do you figure out if there's it is what do they say it is, and it has what they say it has?
Well, you can't. Well, the truth is you can't for everything, but you make some smart choices. And that's why recently I've been talking to people who have I have a woman who's some very weird symptoms right now. And so she's gone back to her doctor to request a brand name for some of the medicines she's taken that she's having some very bizarre side effects with, which should not be, and see if that straightens it out. And sometimes it will. Then for food, I mean, that's partly, I think, why farmers markets are taking off is because at least you can talk to the person producing the food. Now, that I suppose they could lie through their teeth, but they generally don't. You do have only 1 degree separation. You're not getting it from an unknown agri-farm somewhere, possibly another country. And not that other countries aren't growing good food, but people tend to behave as badly as you let them. There's an interesting Netflix series, if you're interested in this, called Rotten, which is about food fraud. And it's pretty much, as we become interested in higher quality food, it's pretty much across the board. I mean, there's food fraud with olive oil, with fish, with peanuts, with honey. So you want to know your producers as much as you can. And you probably want to get a little bit more involved with your food than you have been.
Is there ways to, to viscerally test, when you have a certain food, there are things that you can look out for that would tell you that the food is not what they say it is. Like, for instance, if you're used to eating a lot of wild-caught fish, it has a certain taste, that's different from non-wild-caught. Or if you don't drink diet soda and you drink diet soda, you can tell, which is a bad example. But does that work for a lot of foods? So you could just tell right away by the taste, or it could be masked?
No, you can't really know. And the problem is that most people don't have the time. You can't search it all down. Obviously, that's kind of crazy. I mean, there's some things you can learn here and there. For example, we know that a lot of the nut contaminated olive oils come from Italy and Greece, and the California ones have been testing the best in terms of not having, they were cutting olive oil with hazelnut oil, which is no big deal really in terms of health, unless you have a nut allergy, then it's pretty bad. And I started finding that kids were reacting to olive oil a number of years ago, which shouldn't happen because olives are very non-reactive. And so it was kind of weird that suddenly kids were having trouble with olive oil. I had no idea why they would. I thought, gosh, I guess they're just getting more allergic. But it turned out that it was probably cut with hazelnut oil. And so you have to question. I mean, you just learn to question everything. That was outside of my thinking range. I thought, oh, who would have thought that, right? That they would cut olive oil with a nut oil. That sounds kind of crazy. But they do all kinds of stuff like that now. So you just have to be open-minded about it and be suspicious, I guess. If you don't feel well after you eat something that you've been eating for a while, it's possible there's something in there that shouldn't be.
Well, how do you proactively guard yourself, without going crazy, medicine-wise? I don't know if you could recap what you said to guard yourself. And then food-wise, what are some suggestions?
Well, I think we're friends with our farmer, so we know where some of our food's coming from. So I feel pretty confident that most of the food is pretty good. And of course, if you're eating a lot of produce and fruits and vegetables, that pretty much, it's hard to fake an apple. And now you can lie about whether it's organic, I suppose. But if you're eating produce, you're probably getting produce. Organic is nice, although there is some fraud in that, like everywhere else. But I like to do organic when possible. If you can afford it, that's always a nice thing to do. And and that's pretty much what you have to. Like I said, you have to become more involved with your food supply to some extent.
And medicines. What was the CIPA, the Canadian Pharmacy thing you talked about? What's the role of that company? An organization?
Well, it is. It's an international organization that makes sure that the pharmacies that belong to them are following certain rules and are not just fly-by-night operations where you're getting cornstarch in capsules. And so they have maybe 50 pharmacies that carry a wide range of medicines. Not all of them carry every medicine, but you can source through them to find the best price, and the ones that you can buy generic or non-generic. And like I said, if you're going to go to that trouble, you probably want to get brand name. And like I said, there's a big list of them. So if one pharmacy doesn't carry the drug you need, you can go to a different one. And some of the common drugs, all of them carry. And so that's how we source out medicines. And they generally are about 50% cheaper. Like I said, I have found them even more discounted. I don't think they're so much discounted as they're more fairly priced. Our medicines are very much, I don't know, the prices have been exaggerated. We all know about the insulin crisis over the last couple of years, where they just pushed the price of that way up and out of the reach of some people, which has been devastating. It's a devastating problem.
How much has it gone up? I don't know.
It's 10 or 20 times. I mean, over the last, it's dramatic. I mean, there's been some reports of young, kids in their 20s who are dying because they can't afford. I mean, I actually even saw one of those medical shows, like those doctory shows on TV, where they had one of those stories because of the cost going up so much. People are having trouble affording it. And that's not maybe medicine. That's obviously medicine you just have to be taking.
I can tell you, I use an inhaler, and that's gone up every single time I've gotten it. Now the inhaler is like over $300, when years ago it used to be like $50. So
yeah, it is. Well, and we have some real drug issues, but my job is to try to get people to minimize drugs whenever possible, and a lot of conditions, like I said, are amenable. One of the things that, for example, you've probably noticed that allergies are going up a lot with global climate change. The allergies and pollens are increasing dramatically as the plants are changing and adapting, and the bacteria is changing and adapting to temperature changes. And one of the most interesting research projects came out in a long time. They took a bunch of mice that were sterile, so they had no bacteria on them. Like you and I have 100 trillion bacteria in our body, and these mice were sterile and didn't have any. And what they did was they took some babies that had allergies, and they inoculated these mice with the bacteria from babies that had allergies, and all of the mice developed allergies. And then they took another set of mice and they inoculated them with bacteria from babies that didn't have allergies, and none of them got allergies. So they thought there must be a difference here. And they were actually able to identify a bacteria family called Clostridia that was very low in people that tended to get allergies. So they're hoping, and this is how kind of research right now works, is that it's always sort of geared towards of a product at the other end, but they're hoping to find some bacteria that one day they'll be able to give people who have allergies, and they won't have as many allergies anymore. Now, I think that's sort of a pipe dream. I think that what we need to do is get more diversity with our bacteria, because kids born in this generation have half the bacteria in their body compared to previous generations, and that's because of a lot of dietary and cultural and climate changes. So we need to get that good bacteria back. It seems to be very protective against allergies.
So in your detective work, are you asking for people to get certain labs done, or sequence their microbiome, or do DNA testing? I mean, what kind of things do people need to do if they don't have that info on hand?
Well, most people who see me have seen 4 or 5 people before, so they have enough to start with. But occasionally they don't, or they have a symptom that hasn't been addressed. And there's stool tests you can do, there's blood tests. I try to send them back to their physicians to do that, because there's much more likelihood that they'll get insurance coverage by doing that. But yes, the tests I don't do a whole lot of is genetic testing, although I will send people to certain doctors for that. But there's been a lot of genetic testing in the nutrition field over the last couple of years, and it's not quite ready for clinical use. I mean, some of it's okay. I really like the gene detox testing, where you can test the way that your genes regulate your detoxification pathways. And that's very useful when people have bad side effects from medication, because it usually means they don't know how, or they're not able to, more specifically, break down the medication through their liver, and that's usually genetic. And so you can avoid terrible side effects sometimes by doing that test. That's pretty well developed. It's been around for quite a while now. But some of the newer tests are we know just little pieces of these pathways, and the devil seems to be in what we don't know. with that. But that's coming around, and that's changing very radically.
Are there any common conditions you've had a lot of success with, like let's say in women, chronic fatigue, where they're just tired all the time, that kind of thing?
Well, we see a lot of chronic fatigue. That's definitely one that goes into the complicated situation that you have to manage. What you're seeing a lot right now in women is PCOS, which is polycystic ovary syndrome, which is a form, it's much more common now than it used to be. They say up to 10% of women may have it. And it is a condition, it's a form of almost diabetes that plays out in hormone imbalances. So when people have it, their blood sugars are off, and then their hormones take a powder. And so they end up having a lot of PMS. They can have fertility problems. They have a lot of mood issues. They sometimes rapidly gain weight, have acne. Their hair can be falling out. I just saw a young woman with those problems actually last week, where her hair is falling out and her skin she has some acne, and her periods are a mess. And it is indeed polycystic ovary syndrome. And that's very much a dietary related condition. You have to control it the way you control diabetes. So yes, and there's, of course, there's the baby boomers are hitting menopause, or many of them have already hit menopause. And so we see a lot of postmenopausal issues. And women weren't included in medical studies broadly until just 20 or so years ago. And so we don't know a lot about what healthy aging looks like. And so I deal a lot about what healthy aging looks like. You don't want to always be digging people out of crisis. You want to also be preventing mental issues. We know, for example, that 50% of people by age 80 will have some significant or notable cognitive issues. And so if you want to prevent that, which I hope you would, you want to start thinking about that when you're 50 or 40, not when you're 80 and having symptoms. And so, yeah, there's many things you can do. And I think the real good news is that you have a lot more control over this than you think. You certainly don't have complete control, because we all live together in a polluted environment that has certain issues that we share. We obviously can't be healthy if the rest of the world is not healthy and polluted. But you can make choices within what you can eat and exercise and sleep. And there are some things that you do have control over. And they seem to tip, I would say, a small majority of health issues. So that's the very good news.
So what, again, we come back to that question. I guess the biggest modulator of most health conditions appears to be diet. And then I guess another level is the medications you're taking, checking those.
And exercise is also, I call exercise vitamin M for movement. But in a lot of studies, especially for cognition and with older people, they find exercise is actually more critical than anything. You have to keep moving. So I would say, and a lot of people take medication. So if you're looking for 3 things to do, it would be exercise, eat a low inflammation kind of Mediterranean diet, which is a lot of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and not so much, fried foods, sugar, and heavy meat. And so you would try to sleep well and get some exercise and eat well. And those are the kind of 3 things you can do something about, or at least try to sleep long enough.
That is true.
Very boring, but very helpful. So.
Yeah, I don't know. That's fine. Any other interesting nuance you've seen, the people that you work with?
Well, I think that most people plan to eat better than they actually eat. So if you're really serious about changing your diet, you probably have to do some planning about it, because people mean to eat well, but then life interferes. The meeting went over, you have to pick up the kids, whatever it is. So when people hand me a record of what they've been eating, they often say, oh, this isn't normal, because it's not what they intend to eat. And so I think we have to close that gap between our intentions and what we're actually doing. It takes planning in our busy lives to eat healthy. It doesn't just happen. You just have to make some adjustments, and you can still eat out, and which most of us do more than we used to. There's a lot more healthy choices. There's a lot of places you can eat now that have decent choice. You can go to some of these salad places like Sweet Greens, and that you can just really eat quite well out. but you have to plan it. If that's not on your way home, then you have to find some place that might be, so you don't end up stopping at a fast food joint. And we know that a diet based on those kind of fats, especially that are found in these fast food establishments where they're fried foods or they're packages of some sort, are highly associated with smaller brain volume. And in animal studies when animals eat like that, they have the initial tangles of Alzheimer's disease just from eating kind of bad fats, because your brain is mostly fat. And so you incorporate your fats into your brain. And if you have these shelf-stable fats, you have a brain that doesn't remain as flexible and doesn't send signals in the same way. So by eating these kind of bad fats and these packaged foods, these fried foods over a long period of time, you're doing an uncontrolled experiment with your brain. And so that would be a big takeaway is, watch your fats. Your brain's mostly fat. That's why they call people fatheads.
Yeah. I guess you don't want a shelf-stable brain.
You don't want a shelf-stable brain. That's right.
One.
You want one that can send signals properly. And the kind of fats you use literally incorporate into your brain the way a brick incorporates into a wall. And it changes the way you send signals. That function follows structure. And we know in animal studies where they sacrifice animals and look at their brains, the kind of fats really dramatically change the kind of brains they form. So it's really important, the kind of fats you eat. And many of us are doing a lot of snacking with these shelf-stable fats, and they over time change the structure of your brain. So that might be a takeaway for people. You want to look at your diet, look at the kind of fats you're eating. That can make a big difference. One meta-analysis with 185 studies found that when people took fish oil, looking over all these studies as a whole, they found that there was some amelioration of a junk food diet, that taking fish oil took some of the sting out of some of the bad eating. Now, of course, it's still better to eat, health foods and everything, but fish oil provided some benefit as a protective agent.
What's your opinion of diets that people are on? The keto diet, being a vegan, other diets out there that are popular right now.
Well, I think the best diet is pretty quiet and boring. It's mixed up with, I'm not against people eating meat. I hope that we would raise it more humanely. But there's, the chicken and fish, and mostly you want to have plant-based foods like vegetables and fruits and whole grains and nuts and seeds. You want to use that as a base. And then add perhaps some goat cheese or some low-fat dairy, some fish and chicken on top of that, and lower the processed food aspect, the white food, if you will, aspect. And that's kind of the best diet. It's some version of the Mediterranean diet, just consistently has been found in depression studies and in like there was this, what was that study called? SMILE was the depression study where they found a diet like that helped about a third of people with major depression. It's so that basic diet comes up the best when across the board for anti-inflammation. All these other diets kind of come and go, but they have issues that you have to look at. Ketogenic is very interesting diet. It can be very useful for short periods, but it's very hard to stay on for long periods. People tend to get depressed on it because there's not enough carbs. So you have to adjust it for a 30-day cleansing diet, or maybe 60 days for somebody who's a lot of weight to lose. It would be great, but it's not a long-term diet without modification. The vegan diet is very popular right now, but most vegans I see are junk food vegans, and so they're actually in worse shape. They're not doing it for health at all, because they end up eating a lot of empty starch and not enough protein. You have to, if you want to be vegan, you have to like legumes, and you have to eat at least 1 or 2 times a day some kind of legume type food. And most vegans aren't doing that. They're eating, pizzas without cheese on it, so it's just bread and sauce, type thing, and not eating really enough of these other kinds of protein foods that are concentrated in nutrients. So, like I said, these other kind of more fringy diets, they can be good, but they often need modifications. Vegans in this country have to take vitamin D and B12 also, or else they run into trouble. Yeah, I recently
I've seen her pale, pasty, droopy, unhappy looking. Doesn't seem to be working well.
It's a tough diet. You have to have a really strong metabolism to handle it well. You have to be able to digest very well, because the vegan foods aren't quite as concentrated in nutrients as meat is. Because if you're a cow, 1 pound of flesh is going to be from 8 to 10 pounds possibly of eating some kind of grain. So you're going to really concentrate those nutrients. So there's pros and cons, of course, to meat eating, just that there's pros and cons to being a vegan. But to be strictly vegan, you have to be able to get those nutrients out of the food. And people who do very poorly as vegans have weak digestive systems or are not eating broad enough diet. There's a fair amount of preparation to the vegan diet to do it correctly. So like I said, my feeling about diets is that the best diet's a pretty boring one, but pretty straightforward. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles on it. Most of the diets that are out there is the anti-inflammation diets is some version of the Mediterranean diet. The MIND diet, which is the diet that's based on research that helps brain function. That one is basically a Mediterranean diet with some bells and whistles on it. Most of the ones are bells and whistle enhanced Mediterranean diets.
Okay.
That work.
So in closing, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to do a consult or have questions? And what are some resources you could recommend for people?
Thanks, Richard. Well, they can always email me at office@kellydorfman.com, and Kelly is Kelly, and Dorfman is DORF as in fire, MAN. They can check out my book if they have kids. It's called Cure Your Child with Food, Workman 2013, and it's written like detective stories and tells you how to unravel some of these situations. A lot of adults told me they were able to unravel their own situations, even though it was a book that was written geared towards kids. So perhaps maybe not ear infections if you're an adult, but there's a lot of chapters about mood and tummy aches and other things like that. And those are, I think, the two main resources that I have available.
Well, very good. Thank you for coming on the podcast. And it sounds pretty simple, the things you talked about, but yet there's a lot of nuance and difficulties. So I appreciate you being here.
Oh, no. Nutrition is a very, very interesting field, and I think it's finally starting to get its due. So thanks for asking me, Richard, and have a wonderful afternoon.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.